June 26, 1944. Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. The heavy air was thick with humidity and engine oil, the sounds of distant generators blending with the soft click of checkers on a wooden board. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, commander of the 475th Fighter Group, sat opposite his operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith. Their game paused when a quiet knock sounded at the screen door. A tall civilian stood outside, lean, composed, his face unmistakable even through the haze of tropical light. "Charles Lindbergh," he said evenly. For a moment, MacDonald thought he'd misheard. The Charles Lindbergh, the man who had flown the Atlantic alone 17 years earlier, was now standing in a makeshift recreation hut in the middle of a war zone. Lindbergh wasn't there as a celebrity. He came as a consultant from United Aircraft, asking permission to discuss P-38 Lightning operations. MacDonald hesitated, still holding a checker piece in his hand, unaware that this interruption would change the Pacific Air War forever. In the next 6 weeks, this quiet civilian would teach combat pilots a method so radical it defied every rule they'd been taught, extending the Lightning's range by nearly 400 miles, turning impossible missions into routine sorties. War, science, and one man's precision would soon collide. Before he stood at that screen door in New Guinea, Charles Augustus Lindbergh had already redefined the boundaries of flight. On May 21, 1927, he had crossed the Atlantic alone, 3,600 miles from New York to Paris in a single-engine monoplane, the Spirit of St. Louis. For 33.5 hours, he flew without rest, sight, or even forward vision, his fuel tanks so large they blocked the windshield. He navigated by stars and dead reckoning, using only a periscope and instinct, sharpened by meticulous calculation. Every drop of his 450 gallons of fuel was accounted for. He landed in Paris with only 85 gallons remaining, a triumph of precision and endurance that stunned the world. Where others had gambled on luck and power, Lindbergh trusted in mathematics, discipline, and an almost spiritual understanding of fuel efficiency. He had proven that mastery of the machine was as vital as bravery. That obsession never left him. Through the 1930s, as he charted transoceanic routes for Pan American Airways, Lindbergh perfected the art of coaxing range from engines. He learned that published performance limits were only rough guidelines, averages, not absolutes. Beneath the surface numbers lay hidden efficiency, waiting to be unlocked by those who understood the relationship between manifold pressure, RPM, and fuel mixture as a kind of living equation. By 1944, that same mastery would find new purpose, not over calm oceans, but in the furnace skies of the Pacific. By the early 1940s, Charles Lindbergh was not merely a pioneer, he was a pariah. Once hailed as the man who brought glory to American aviation, his fame had curdled into suspicion and political exile. His outspoken opposition to U.S. involvement in the European War, his leadership of the America First Committee, and his ill-fated speeches warning against conflict had placed him in direct opposition to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1941, Roosevelt publicly compared Lindbergh to a Confederate sympathizer, a stinging rebuke that struck at the aviator's pride and honor. Days later, Lindbergh resigned his commission in the Army Air Corps Reserve. The man who had once symbolized America's daring spirit was now branded unpatriotic, his uniform stripped away not by scandal or failure, but by principle and politics. When Pearl Harbor plunged the nation into war, Lindbergh tried to return to service. But Roosevelt blocked his reinstatement personally. No uniform, no commission. His wings, it seemed, had been clipped. Yet Lindbergh refused to vanish into obscurity. Instead, he turned his genius toward the private sector, quietly becoming a civilian consultant to some of America's most important aircraft manufacturers. He joined United Aircraft in 1943, working with Chance Vought, the makers of the F-4U Corsair, and later with Ford at Willow Run, helping to troubleshoot B-24 Liberator production problems. He even risked his life conducting high-altitude test flights in P-47 Thunderbolts, searching for the limits of their engines. In every role, he brought the same obsession for efficiency and performance that had carried him across the Atlantic. He analyzed air pressure, temperature, and fuel flow with an almost surgical precision. He discovered new dive-bombing techniques for the Corsair, showed pilots how to safely take off with double their rated bomb loads, and saved aircraft that might have been lost to error or inefficiency. But what Lindbergh wanted most wasn't found in laboratories or factories. It was in the cockpit, under the open sky. He longed for combat, the chance to prove that knowledge, not just bravery, could win wars. And by 1944, opportunity came calling. Through United Aircraft, Lindbergh proposed a study of twin-engine fighters in real combat conditions. The U.S. had only one frontline aircraft that fit the bill, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. With quiet persistence, Lindbergh arranged to go to the Pacific as a technical observer. In truth, he was on a mission to fly again and to change the way America fought its air war. On April 3, 1944, the same man once barred from military service packed his gear in San Diego. He bought a plain Navy-style uniform without insignia and a small pocket-sized New Testament, noting in his journal, "Since I can only carry one book and a very small one, that is my choice. The more I learn, the less competition it has. Unmarked and unrecognized." The world's most famous pilot boarded a transport ship bound for war. The journey to the Pacific Theater was long and quiet, an odyssey into isolation that mirrored Lindbergh's own exile from public life. His ship, crawling across the vast Pacific waters, carried not only supplies, but also one man with unfinished business. Lindbergh spent his days on deck studying flight manuals, reviewing maps, and writing notes on performance theory. To most aboard, he was just another civilian engineer. Few realized that the unassuming man staring at the horizon was once the most famous pilot on Earth. He landed first at Port Moresby, New Guinea, a steaming, chaotic hub of Allied operations. The air smelled of avgas and dust, the sky thick with the constant drone of engines. Fighters and bombers came and went like swarms of metal insects, each mission carving small victories and losses across the endless jungle below. When Lindbergh stepped off the transport, he was an outsider in every sense. His khaki uniform bore no rank, no ribbons, no authority, just the quiet confidence of someone who had seen both glory and disgrace. To many young pilots stationed there, Lindy was a legend from history books, not a man who belonged on an active flight line. But he wasted no time. Reporting to the headquarters of the 5th Air Force, he explained his purpose: to study fuel efficiency in combat aircraft. Specifically, he wanted to understand the operational limits of the P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine fighter prized for its range and speed, but infamous for its fuel hunger. He was met with skepticism. The war didn't need scientists, it needed fighters. Yet there was something disarming about Lindbergh's calm determination. The measured way he spoke of manifold pressure curves and mixture control tolerances. He didn't sound like a dreamer. He sounded like an engineer who had come prepared to prove every word. By late May 1944, Lindbergh's request was approved on a limited basis. He was assigned to the 475th Fighter Group, the famed Satan's Angels, stationed at Hollandia, New Guinea. There, he would conduct in-field tests and advise on operational efficiency. To the pilots of the 475th, the news was surreal. Charles Lindbergh, the man who flew across the Atlantic, was coming to fly their aircraft. Some expected a publicity stunt. Others suspected politics. But what none of them knew was that within weeks, that same civilian would climb into their cockpits, rewrite the limits of the P-38 Lightning, and make every pilot in the squadron rethink what was possible. The outcast had come to war, not as a symbol, but as a scientist ready to fight. June 1944. The humid air at Hollandia Air Base shimmered under the midday sun, the roar of engines echoing from distant revetments. Mechanics moved like ghosts between the silver shapes of P-38 Lightnings, their twin booms glinting in the heat. The 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, was resting between missions, their pilots lounging in makeshift tents, drinking tepid coffee and swatting at flies. Into this world walked a man whose name belonged in textbooks, not in the mud of a Pacific airfield. Charles Lindbergh arrived quietly, a clipboard under his arm, his khaki uniform unadorned by rank. He introduced himself with a polite nod, no ceremony, no entourage. Some pilots barely looked up. To them, he was just another civilian engineer. Lieutenant Colonel Charles McDonald, the group's commander, was one of the first to truly study him. "So," he said, half skeptical, "you're the Charles Lindbergh?" Lindbergh smiled faintly. "Yes, sir. But here, I'm just a consultant." Over the next few days, Lindbergh walked the flight lines, talking to mechanics and pilots, taking notes on engine performance, fuel loads, and sortie ranges. He listened more than he spoke, asking quiet questions that revealed a mind working several layers deep. He studied the Lightning as though it were alive, touching its skin, tracing the lines of its turbochargers, and inspecting the controls with the reverence of a surgeon. He wanted to know not only what it could do, but how far it could go if pushed the right way. The pilots were wary. To them, flying was instinct and aggression, not theory and math. Lindbergh's talk of mixture lean-out and manifold pressure differentials seemed abstract, until he started climbing into the cockpit himself. The first time he strapped into a P-38, there was a hush around the airstrip. A civilian, flying a combat aircraft in an active war zone, it was almost unheard of. Yet when the twin Allison engines roared to life, Lindbergh handled the Lightning with effortless control. He taxied out like he'd done it 1,000 times before, took off smoothly, and vanished into the horizon. 2 hours later, he landed, logged his data, and began adjusting flight procedures. He spoke of running engines at low RPM and high manifold pressure, a combination pilots had always been warned would blow the heads clean off, but Lindbergh insisted it was safe, if managed correctly. That day, the men of the 475th began to realize this wasn't the Lindbergh of newspaper headlines. This was a pilot who could feel an engine breathe. The war had just gained a new kind of weapon, precision. At Hollandia, pilots of the 475th had lived by a simple truth. The P-38 Lightning was fast, deadly, and thirsty. Its twin Allison engines devoured fuel, and range was a constant enemy. Every briefing began and ended with the same caution. Don't push your manifold pressure too high. Don't run too lean. Keep your RPM steady. Lindbergh listened patiently to these warnings, then began to test their limits. He didn't dismiss the engineer's data. He reinterpreted it. Where others saw danger, he saw untapped efficiency hiding between the numbers. He began experimenting with a method that defied standard practice, reducing engine RPM while increasing manifold pressure. In most pilots' minds, that was suicide, a sure way to melt pistons or detonate fuel. But Lindbergh's calculations showed otherwise. If managed with precision, it could yield enormous fuel savings while maintaining power. So he took a Lightning up again, this time on a 600-mile test flight over open ocean. He trimmed the propellers back to suction 600 RPM, hundreds below standard, and advanced the throttles carefully to 46 inches of manifold pressure. Then he leaned the fuel mixture until the exhausts burned a faint blue-white, the sweet spot of combustion. He flew for hours, recording every flicker of his gauges. When he returned, his fuel tanks told the story. He had consumed nearly 1/3 less fuel than standard mission procedure. The ground crew thought it was an error. The pilots thought it was impossible. But Lindbergh calmly laid out the math, explaining how reduced piston friction and optimal pressure balance created a more efficient burn. He translated engineering into survival. To prove it, he offered to demonstrate on a real mission. Not a test flight, combat. The pilots laughed, half in disbelief, half in admiration. No civilian had ever volunteered for such a thing. Yet Lindbergh wasn't joking. He wanted to fly into battle, not to seek glory, but to prove that science could be as deadly as courage. Within days, the 475th's flight schedule carried a strange entry. Pilot, C.A. Lindbergh, civilian technical observer, and beside it, a mission route straight into enemy territory. June 28, 1944. The dawn air hung thick over Hollandia as a squadron of P-38 Lightnings rolled down the steel mat runway, their propellers slicing through the rising heat. Among them, in aircraft number 155, sat an unlikely pilot, Charles A. Lindbergh, civilian, engineer, legend, and outcast, now flying into a live combat zone. For the men of the 475th Fighter Group, it was a moment of disbelief. No other civilian in the Pacific had been cleared for operational flight, let alone combat. Yet there he was, calm and meticulous, hands steady on the throttles as his twin Allisons surged with restrained power. The mission was to strike Japanese, shipping and installations along the northern coast of New Guinea. A dangerous run through unpredictable weather, mountains, and the constant threat of anti-aircraft fire. Lindbergh had volunteered not as a publicity stunt, but as proof. He wanted to demonstrate that his engine technique could stretch the Lightning's range without sacrificing performance. As the formation climbed to altitude, Lindbergh throttled back to 1,600 RPM and adjusted his manifold pressure to 46 inches, the same danger zone setting that every pilot had been taught to avoid. The others watched, waiting for his engines to falter. They didn't. Instead, his P-38 cruised smoothly, burning fuel at a fraction of the normal rate. Hours later, they approached the target area, Japanese barges and fuel dumps hidden beneath palm camouflage. The group dived in low, guns and bombs unleashed in perfect coordination. Tracers cut through the haze. Explosions rippled across the shoreline. When the squadron regrouped for the long flight home, many began to worry about their dwindling fuel. But Lindbergh's gauges told a different story. He still had reserves to spare. As the others throttled back, praying to reach base, Lindbergh cruised beside them, calm and measured, as if he'd planned it down to the last drop because he had. When they landed, he climbed out silently, brushed the dust off his flight suit, and logged his data with the same precision as always. There were no cheers, no photos, just the quiet, recognition that something extraordinary had happened. The myth had become a teacher, and the 475th Fighter Group had just witnessed a miracle of mathematics in motion. At first, many of the younger pilots refused to believe it. They'd been raised on the gospel of high RPM, low manifold pressure. They had watched engines explode when mishandled, and every manual warned against the kind of settings Lindbergh had used in combat. But then came the numbers. Flight reports showed that his techniques extended operational range from 450 miles to nearly 600, sometimes more. That meant the P-38 could now strike targets once thought unreachable, without carrying drop tanks or cutting power mid-mission. Lindbergh became a daily fixture on the flight line. He moved among the pilots, explaining in quiet, patient tones how fuel mixture, pressure, and RPM interacted. He showed them how to feel the engine, to sense when combustion was balanced perfectly. One by one, the skeptics began to try it for themselves. Lieutenant Mac McDonough was among the first. After a single mission using Lindbergh's technique, he landed with almost 80 gallons more fuel than usual. "Hell," he said, grinning. "If this civilian's wrong, I'll eat my flight boots." Even the mechanics, hardened by months of field repairs, began to nod in respect. Lindbergh's flights didn't destroy engines, they preserved them. The cooler operating temperatures and efficient combustion extended engine life, reduced wear, and increased mission reliability. The transformation was subtle at first. A few pilots tried the method, then a few more. Within weeks, it became routine procedure for the 475th. Word spread fast, across squadrons, across islands. The P-38 Lightning, once limited by fuel range, was suddenly capable of escorting bombers deep into Japanese territory. Further, faster, longer. The pilots started calling it Lindberghing the throttles, and the name that Washington had buried was quietly resurrected, not in headlines, but in the sky, July 3, 1944, over the emerald waters near Nome 4 Island, the 475th Fighter Group thundered toward their target. Below them, Japanese anti-aircraft fire clawed upward in thin black arcs. Among the formation was a P-38 piloted not by a soldier, but by a civilian, still flying under the quiet designation Technical Observer, C.A. Lindbergh. It was supposed to be a standard mission, escorting bombers during an airfield strike, but mid-flight, the weather turned. Thunderheads rose like gray fortresses, winds buffeting the lightnings into violent turbulence. Radio chatter filled with panic as fuel gauges began to drop faster than expected. Then Lindbergh's calm voice broke through the static. "Ease your props back, 1600 RPM, hold 45 inches manifold pressure. Trust it." One by one, pilots followed his lead. The storm cleared and the formation steadied. Against all odds, they reached Nomfor, strafed enemy supply lines, and returned home with enough fuel to spare. When they landed, no one laughed anymore. They had seen proof, not in theory, but in survival. That day marked the turning point. Lindbergh's once controversial engine settings became standard practice across the group. To the younger pilots, it felt like witchcraft. But to Lindbergh, it was simply listening to the machine. Every piston, every vibration told a story, and he had learned its language long before the war began. Word of his methods spread through command channels and eventually reached headquarters. Some officers balked. "A civilian teaching combat pilots? Impossible!" But the results were undeniable. Missions once aborted for fuel limits were now completed with efficiency unimagined months before. For the first time, the P-38 Lightning wasn't just a fighter. It was a strategic weapon, and behind that transformation was the man Washington had exiled. As reports piled up, so did the skepticism. Officially, Lindbergh was forbidden from combat. Unofficially, he was rewriting the operational manual of the P-38. He flew an average of 4 missions a week, each one more daring than the last, always logging every detail: fuel pressure, altitude, power settings, weather, even pilot reactions. His technique transformed air warfare mathematics. Where engineers saw fuel consumption in gallons per hour, Lindbergh measured it in miles per heartbeat. He treated each sortie like an experiment, adjusting a single variable, analyzing the results with precision bordering on obsession. Pilots began to challenge him, half in jest, half in awe. "Let's see you make this run with your voodoo settings, Lindy." And he would, every time, returning with cleaner engines and fuller tanks. Soon, bomber groups took notice. The new efficiency extended fighter range enough for them to escort B-24 Liberators and B-25 Mitchells deeper into enemy territory than ever before. Missions that once required perilous mid-air diversions were now smooth, predictable, and deadly. But Lindbergh's work wasn't only about numbers, it was about mindset. He taught the pilots to think like engineers, to respect their machines as living systems rather than brute force tools. Under his quiet influence, the squadron matured. Reckless energy gave way to disciplined mastery. At the officer's tent, MacDonald finally admitted to his peers, "I thought he was here to play scientist. Turns out he's rewriting air warfare, and though no medals could honor him, every successful mission bore his invisible signature, etched not in ink, but in the rhythm of the engines that refused to quit." July 28, 1944. Mission over Seram Island. The morning sky was sharp and clear, the sea below a silver mirror. Lindbergh flew as wingman to Major Danforth Miller, both assigned to strike Japanese barges near Amahai. It was supposed to be reconnaissance, in and out, no contact. But war rarely follows plan. As they banked along the coastline, 2 enemy aircraft, Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars, appeared out of the clouds. Fast, agile, and deadly, they dove straight for the formation. Lindbergh's training instincts kicked in. He broke formation, throttled forward, and felt the lightning surge with that deep mechanical growl he knew so well. Using his fuel-saving settings, he gained altitude faster than the others, cutting inside the enemy's dive. He rolled hard, lined up his sights, and fired a short, measured burst. The tracers struck the Oscar's wing root, ripping through its fuselage. Flames bloomed. The Japanese fighter spiraled down, trailing smoke into the jungle below. Silence filled his headset for a moment. Then Miller's voice cracked through. "Jesus Christ, Lindbergh just shot one down." It was his first and only confirmed kill. and it made him, unofficially, the only civilian combat ace in history. Back at base, the squadron erupted in disbelief. The man who'd come to teach efficiency had now proven his mettle in fire. His calm demeanor never wavered. He simply logged his ammunition use and flight data like always. But in that moment, Charles Lindbergh, the exiled hero, the unwanted scientist, had found redemption 20,000 feet above Ceram, August 3, 1944, Halmahera Island, Dutch East Indies. The dawn air shimmered with tropical humidity as the P-38s of the 475th Fighter Group roared down the strip, their propellers cutting the mist into spirals of vapor. Lindbergh was flying again, this time on a deep strike mission against Japanese shipping convoys. The plan was simple: low-level approach, attack at sunrise, and return before enemy interceptors could scramble. But halfway through, the mission fell apart. Clouds rolled in, visibility dropped to near zero, and radio contact became patchy. Pilots began burning through their fuel reserves faster than predicted. Panic crept in. Lindbergh's calm voice came over the radio. "Hold formation. Reduce RPM to 1600, maintain 42 inches manifold. You'll make it home." They did. Every aircraft. The post-mission analysis stunned the command staff. The group had flown farther, faster, and longer than any recorded Lightning mission in the Pacific, without a single loss. When questioned, Lindbergh explained it as though it were obvious. "The airplane isn't your servant. It's your partner. If you understand its rhythm, it'll take you farther than the manual says possible." His report circulated through the Pacific Air Command like wildfire. Engineers in Brisbane verified his data, then sent it to Washington. Within weeks, Lindbergh's power settings were incorporated into official P-38 flight manuals, without rank, without title, and without recognition. He had just rewritten U.S. Army Air Force's doctrine, again. By late August 1944, the 475th Fighter Group was no longer just another Pacific unit. It was the most efficient long-range strike force in the theater. Lindbergh's teachings had spread to every pilot, mechanic, and crew chief on the island. Fuel consumption dropped by nearly 15%. Mission range increased by more than 40 miles. Even McDonald, once skeptical, now swore by Lindy settings. They called it flying the Lindbergh way. Pilots developed a quiet reverence for the man. He was no longer the outsider scientist. He was one of them, living in a tent, flying the same dangerous missions, eating the same rations. He never sought command, never raised his voice. But every man in the 475th understood that when Lindbergh spoke, you listened. During one late-night debrief, he told a young lieutenant, "Anyone can push a throttle forward. Real skill is knowing how far you can pull it back and still win." That single sentence became an unofficial motto across the squadron. Under his influence, the 475th began flying deeper strikes into the Philippines, destroying Japanese airfields and shipping with brutal precision. The once exiled aviator had now become a symbol, not of politics or controversy, but of mastery and control in an age defined by chaos. By September 1944, whispers of Lindbergh's combat flying reached higher command. Officially, civilians weren't allowed to fly combat missions. Unofficially, the results were impossible to ignore. General George Kenney, commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, reviewed the reports personally. His reaction was blunt. "If a man can get twice the range out of our fighters, I don't care if he's wearing overalls. He flies." Still, Washington didn't see it that way. Orders came down from the War Department. Lindbergh is to be immediately withdrawn from combat operations. But pulling him out wasn't easy. The pilots protested. McDonald sent a formal message requesting delay, citing ongoing testing and fuel economy trials. It bought them a few more weeks, enough time for Lindbergh to fly his final missions. In those last sorties, he didn't just pilot, he taught. He trained young men who would later become instructors themselves, embedding his fuel-saving techniques permanently into U.S. doctrine. When he finally received his recall orders, the men of the 475th lined the runway as he taxied out. Engines idling, he waved once through the cockpit glass. No speeches, no fanfare, just the quiet understanding that he had changed everything, and as his P-38 disappeared into the Pacific haze, the pilots who watched him go didn't see a disgraced civilian. They saw a legend. When Lindbergh's transport left Hollandia, the Pacific War kept moving forward, but his fingerprints were everywhere. Within weeks, flight operations across the Southwest Pacific adopted Lindbergh cruise settings as standard practice. Pilots who had once doubted him now spoke his name with reverence. Fuel reports from multiple fighter groups confirmed what Lindbergh had promised, and more. Flights that used to end with engines sputtering home now finished with an hour's reserve still in the tanks. In a war where running out of fuel meant death by ocean, that extra margin was everything. The transformation was so profound that U.S. engineers began recalculating P-38 mission planning entirely. Charts that had once shown hard limits were redrawn. Targets that had been out of reach were suddenly within striking distance. Behind closed doors, even those who had once despised Lindbergh's politics were forced to admit his math had won the war of miles. As one report from 5th Air Force bluntly stated, operational endurance increased by 31% with no loss of reliability. Recommend adoption theater-wide. A single man, forbidden from wearing a uniform, had changed the range of an empire's air war. Lindbergh's methods weren't magic. They were mechanics, rooted in pure understanding of how an engine breathes. Every pilot knew the throttle, prop lever, and mixture control, but few truly understood the conversation happening inside those cylinders. Lindbergh did. He had learned it over oceans in the hum of the Spirit of St. Louis. When a wrong mixture meant drifting into darkness with no radio, no light, no second chance, he taught the P-38 pilots that the key wasn't more power, it was smarter power. Running engines at lower RPM with higher manifold pressure meant each combustion stroke worked harder, not faster. Fewer explosions, but more energy per drop of fuel, he told them. Think of your engines like lungs. You can pant and tire quickly, or you can breathe deep and last forever. That simple analogy stuck. It became part of pilot culture, something no manual could teach. Lindbergh had turned fuel economy into philosophy, and philosophy into survival. By late 1944, what began as field notes scribbled in a jungle hut became printed doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Forces officially added Lindbergh power settings to the pilot training manual for the P-38 Lightning. The changes were subtle on paper. Cruise RPM reduced from 2200 to 1600 manifold pressure increased to 30 inches, mixture lean to auto lean. Airspeed stabilized at 185 mph, but the impact was revolutionary. Training instructors from California to New Guinea began teaching these numbers as gospel. Even new aircraft designs, like the P-51 Mustang, adopted similar long-range fuel management techniques. Lindbergh's 6-week experiment had become global military procedure. When reporters asked General Kenny about it after the war, his answer was characteristically short. He taught us how to fly farther. That's all you need to know. For Charles Lindbergh, the Pacific wasn't just another front in a world war. It was a crucible of redemption. A place where the noise of politics faded beneath the deeper thunder of engines and monsoon rain. Once, he had been America's shining symbol of courage, the lone man who crossed the Atlantic, the embodiment of progress and daring. But that light had dimmed. His outspoken isolationist stance before the war, his speeches that many thought sympathetic to Germany, had turned admiration into outrage. By 1941, Franklin Roosevelt himself had branded him unfit to wear the uniform of the United States. The man who had once unified a nation now stood as its most controversial son, yet when the war spread to every ocean and sky, Lindbergh could not remain on the ground. In 1944, with quiet determination and no official commission, he found his way to the South Pacific. There, among the humid jungles of New Guinea, his reputation meant nothing. What mattered was experience. Who could fly, who could fight, and who could survive. The men of the 475th Fighter Group didn't greet him as a hero. Many didn't even believe he'd really come. But when he climbed into a P-38 Lightning, adjusted his flight goggles, and ran his pre-flight checks with the methodical calm of a man who had lived his life by instruments, something changed. Lindbergh wasn't there to talk. He was there to teach. He showed the young pilots how to stretch their range by managing engine power and fuel mixture with surgical precision. He demonstrated how a pilot could fly farther, fight longer, and still have enough fuel to return home safely. In an air war defined by distance and exhaustion, that knowledge meant survival. Combat missions soon erased the last traces of skepticism. The quiet civilian from Minnesota flew formation with them, traded enemy fire, and returned with bullet holes in his own aircraft. In the air, he was just another pilot, except perhaps a little steadier, a little more exact, a little more aware of what it meant to push a machine to its limits and come back alive. Lindbergh never boasted, never lectured. He spoke through precision, through numbers written neatly in flight logs, through calm radio calls during chaos. The men began to realize they were flying with someone who not only understood machines, but respected them as living extensions of human endurance. Decades later, one of those pilots would write, "He came to us a civilian. He left a brother. We didn't care what they said about him back home. Out here, he flew the same as us, and sometimes better." For Lindbergh, redemption didn't come in ceremonies or headlines. It came at 10,000 feet, in the whine of superchargers and the trembling rhythm of twin engines pushing through storm clouds, in the endless blue of the Pacific, far from newspapers and politics. Charles Lindbergh found what he had lost, not fame, but purpose. And in the eyes of the men who flew beside him, that was enough. July 28, 1944, El Paputi Bay, New Guinea. The sky was white with heat and scattered cloud, the kind of day where distance shimmered and judgment blurred. Lindbergh flew lead element with Captain McDonald's section, another long-range strike over Japanese-held territory. They had been airborne for hours, throttled back, cruising on Lindbergh's now famous settings. Below, the jungle unrolled in endless green ribbons. Suddenly the calm broke. "Bandits 2 o'clock high." Out of the haze, a pair of Japanese P-51s dived, light bombers escorted by nimble Zero fighters. The formation scattered. P-38s snapped into defensive turns, engines howling as throttles slammed forward. Lindbergh pulled hard right, his Lightning rolling inverted to meet the attack head-on. He hadn't come here to fight. Civilians weren't even supposed to engage. But instinct overrode caution. A Zero crossed his nose at 400 yards. Lindbergh's hands moved with the precision of muscle memory. Lead, fire, correct. The P-38's nose guns spat flame. The tracers arced perfectly into the Japanese fighter's path. The Zero blossomed into a fireball, spiraling into the jungle canopy below. McDonald's voice crackled through the radio, half disbelief, half awe. "Lindy, did you just—" "Confirmed hit," Lindbergh replied quietly. That was it. No celebration, no exclamation, just calm. After landing, the mechanics gathered around his aircraft, still streaked with oil and jungle debris. The other pilots cheered, but Lindbergh simply wiped his goggles and noted the fuel burn rate in his logbook, as if the kill were a mere footnote. He later wrote in his journal, "I have shot down a man in war. It was not glory, only necessity. The airplane was the real weapon. I was only its witness. It would be his only confirmed kill. But in that moment, the exile of America became a warrior again, not for politics, but for flight itself." After El Paputi Bay, something shifted in how the 475th saw him. Lindbergh was no longer just the scientist who made engines last longer. He was one of them, proven in combat. Pilots began carrying handwritten Lindy settings taped to their instrument panels. New replacements learned them before even firing their guns. Ground crews referred to his recommendations during maintenance checks. But Lindbergh didn't let fame follow. He still lived in a simple tent, still ate with the enlisted men, still refused special treatment. When McDonald once joked that he could have any general's office he wanted, Lindbergh just smiled. "I already have the best one," he said, pointing toward the cockpit of his P-38. That quiet humility made his legend grow even more. Back in Washington, His enemies still whispered about his pre-war politics, but in the Pacific no one cared. The men who had seen him fly knew the truth, that this man, stripped of rank and reputation, had become the embodiment of pure aviation. He didn't fight for flags or forgiveness. He fought for mastery, the art of flight itself. When Lindbergh returned to the United States in late 1944, he brought more than memories. He brought data. Logs, charts, manifold readings, RPM to fuel ratios, and climb performance metrics from hundreds of hours in the P-38. He delivered them personally to engineers at Wright Field, Ohio. They pored over his figures and realized the implications. His methods could extend not only fighters but bombers, transports, and patrol aircraft. The Air Force quietly distributed his findings across the fleet. Without fanfare, every long-range mission flown. In the last year of the war, from B-29, raids to Mustang escorts, benefited from the lessons of the civilian test pilot who had once been banned from combat. Even the Navy took notice. Grumman engineers adapted Lindbergh's mixture control techniques to the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, increasing their Pacific endurance by over 15%. Lindbergh never sought credit. He never wrote a report demanding recognition. He only cared that pilots made it home, and they did. Thousands of them. By the summer of 1945, the vast engines of war that had once shaken the earth and blackened the skies began to wind down. The Pacific, once alive with the roar of engines and the flash of tracer fire, fell eerily silent. The surrender of Japan in August marked not just the end of the deadliest conflict in human history, but the close of an era defined by flight, innovation, and sacrifice. For Charles Augustus Lindbergh, the man who had once been both America's greatest hero and its most complicated exile, the war's end was something deeper than victory. It was vindication. The same hands that had once guided the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic had, 2 decades later, helped shape the way Allied pilots fought and survived. When peace finally returned, Lindbergh slipped quietly back into civilian life. No parades, no public statements. He refused interviews, avoided cameras, and turned down the medals offered by the very military that had once doubted him. Those who sought grand speeches found only silence. He preferred instead the company of his logbooks, carefully writing down engine pressures, fuel mixtures, and performance figures that no one else had thought to record in such detail. To the outside world, he was a relic, a man whose fame had burned too bright, whose politics had cast too long a shadow. But among the aviators of the Pacific, Lindbergh's name carried a different meaning. They hadn't cared for his controversies or his headlines. They remembered the man who had stood beside them in the heat of battle, calm and precise, showing them how to push their aircraft a little farther, stay airborne a little longer, survive one more mission. A pilot from the 475th Fighter Group later wrote, "We didn't fly for him. We flew because of him. He showed us what the machines could really do, and maybe what we could do too." In those words lay the quiet truth of Lindbergh's redemption. He hadn't erased his past, and he hadn't tried to. Instead, he had rewritten it in the sky, one flight at a time. His silence became his statement. As the last Mustangs returned from their patrols and the final bombers found their way home, the story of Lindbergh's wartime journey faded into the footnotes of history. But for those who had seen him in the cockpit, steady, disciplined, eyes fixed on the horizon, he remained a reminder that skill and conviction could outlive controversy. The war had ended. The world was rebuilding, and Charles Lindbergh, the man once called both traitor and pioneer, had found peace not through applause or absolution, but through the simple act of flight. His silence, in the end, spoke louder than any headline ever could. When the gunfire finally ceased in 1945, the world's factories began to hum with a different sound, peacetime production. Yet, in the midst of the rebuilding, aviation quietly entered a new era, one born from the experiments of men like Lindbergh. He returned not as a hero on parade, but as an advisor, slipping almost invisibly into America's aerospace laboratories. He carried worn notebooks filled with high-altitude engine readings, pressure ratios, and fuel flow curves drawn in pencil during combat. Those same pages became the starting point for post-war research into efficient power management. At Wright Field, engineers used his data to design early fuel injection systems and turbo superchargers that balanced output and endurance. The phrase Lindbergh range curve appeared in more than one test report, a quiet acknowledgement that the man who once pushed throttles in the jungle was now influencing the blueprints of the future. Civilian manufacturers took notice too. Lockheed and Douglas engineers applied his ideas to long-range commercial transports, while Packard analysts integrated them into automotive testing. Chasing the same balance of power and economy he had mastered, Lindbergh refused publicity. When reporters asked what he was working on, he would simply reply, "Just trying to make engines. Breathe a little better." Behind that understatement was a revolution, the foundation for post-war efficiency, standards in both military and civilian aviation. The late 1940s found Lindbergh traveling again, not across battlefields, but between laboratories and test ranges. The Army Air Forces invited him to observe high-speed jet research at Muroc Dry Lake, the place that would later be renamed Edwards Air Force Base. To the new generation of pilots, he was a ghost from another age, the man who had flown solo across the Atlantic before they were born. Yet when he spoke, they listened. He emphasized restraint, throttle discipline, airflow management, and respect for the machine. His counsel was practical, not poetic. When a young test pilot once boasted that he could outrun physics, Lindbergh smiled thinly and said, "You can't outrun physics, son. You can only borrow from it, and you always have to pay it back." His influence reached into the Navy's carrier aviation as well. Fuel management protocols for early jet aircraft mirrored his wartime teachings almost word for word. The phrase "power for endurance profiles" became standard terminology in the manuals. Through it all, he stayed away from the spotlight. No press releases, no ceremonies, only the sound of engines and the pursuit of better performance. As the 1950s unfolded, Lindbergh's fascination with power evolved into something deeper. He began to see the Earth itself as an engine, one with its own delicate balance of inputs and exhaust. While consulting on aviation efficiency, he traveled frequently to the Pacific Islands and Africa, witnessing firsthand the destruction wrought by industrial expansion. The jungles that had once hidden Japanese airstrips were now being carved apart by logging roads. In his journals, he wrote, "I spent half my life learning to make engines burn fuel better. Perhaps the rest of it should be spent making men burn less of it." That realization marked the birth of Lindbergh's environmentalism, a shift from conquering the air to protecting the world beneath it. He began advising on quieter engines, cleaner fuels, and longer-range designs that would minimize consumption. To engineers, he still spoke in numbers and pressure readings. But to those who knew him, his mission had changed. He was no longer trying to extend the reach of mankind. He was trying to restrain it. Time softened even Washington's memory. By the early 1960s, the U.S. government formally invited Lindbergh back into the fold. Presidents and generals now viewed him not as a political outcast, but as a living symbol of aviation's birth. When he toured Air Force facilities, young pilots treated him with reverence. Few realized that the techniques they used daily, the engine settings, the cruise profiles, the efficiency charts, all traced their lineage back to the quiet civilian who once flew combat missions in secret. In 1954, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for his writings on flight and exploration. Later, he received a Congressional Gold Medal, an ironic bookend for the man who had once been banned from military service. When asked what he felt about redemption, Lindbergh answered simply, "I never asked for it." The sky doesn't judge. For him, vindication wasn't found in applause. It was found in the endless hum of an engine running just right. By the dawn of the 1960s, piston engines were giving way to turbines, and the roar of jets replaced the steady hum of propellers. To most, it was a clean break, a new chapter of flight unbound by the old laws of combustion and propeller drag, but Lindbergh didn't see it that way. To him, a jet was simply another breathing machine, governed by the same truths of efficiency, temperature, and balance. When engineers at Boeing and Pratt & Whitney invited him to observe early tests of high-bypass turbofan engines, Lindbergh watched with his usual silence, notebook in hand. He noted airflow pressures, fuel rates, and compressor ratios, translating them in his mind back to the same principles he'd learned in a P-38 cockpit. Don't waste what you can control. He advised the teams to focus on specific thrust per pound of fuel, a metric that later became a core design philosophy in commercial jet development. Even as aviation moved beyond pistons, Lindbergh's fingerprints remained, the pursuit of range through restraint. When the first Boeing 707 entered service, engineers quietly acknowledged his influence. The jet's cruise efficiency reflected the same balance of thrust and economy Lindbergh had preached 2 decades earlier in the Pacific. And though his name never appeared in any manual, every pilot who trimmed a jet engine for endurance was, knowingly or not, flying the Lindbergh way. In 1969, Lindbergh stood at the edge of the runway at Le Bourget, the same airfield where, 42 years earlier, he had landed the Spirit of St. Louis and changed history. But this time, he wasn't alone in the sky. Above him, 2 icons of the new age roared across the clouds, the Anglo-French Concorde and the American Boeing 747. Both were born of the lessons he had spent his life teaching: efficiency, endurance, and trust in the machine. He watched the Concorde streak past, supersonic and gleaming, its afterburners painting the sky with white fire. To most onlookers, it symbolized humanity's victory over distance. To Lindbergh, it was both triumph and warning, the ultimate expression of man's hunger for speed, but also a reminder of how easily progress could outpace understanding. Later that day, a journalist asked him what he thought of the future of flight. He paused, then said, "We can go anywhere now, but I wonder if we still know why." It was the kind of answer only Lindbergh could give, one that sounded like philosophy but came from engineering. The man who had once flown alone across an empty ocean now stood beneath, a sky filled with machines that crossed it in hours. And yet, even as flight grew faster and louder, his quiet pursuit of balance remained its foundation. In his later years, Lindbergh withdrew from the world of engines and noise. He moved to Maui, Hawaii, where the ocean and sky stretched in endless blue, the same colors that had once surrounded him over the Atlantic. Visitors found him contemplative, often sketching designs for aircraft that would never be built: gliders, solar planes, silent wings. His notebooks, still precise and mathematical, were filled not with equations for speed but for endurance. He corresponded with environmental scientists, conservationists, and even NASA engineers, advocating for cleaner propulsion and minimal impact flight. What began as an obsession with fuel economy had become a moral calling, to fly responsibly in the vast system of nature. In 1974, as illness began to take hold, he requested that no grand ceremonies be held. His only wish was to be buried overlooking the Pacific, the same ocean he had crossed, fought above, and ultimately learned to protect. On August 26, 1974, Charles A. Lindbergh made his final flight, not through air, but into memory. His gravestone bore only a simple inscription: "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." No dates, no titles, just the essence of a man who had lived between earth and sky. Decades later, the roar of modern engines still carries an echo of Lindbergh's lessons. Every flight computer optimizing fuel burn, every cruise setting programmed for range, every aerodynamic curve traced for endurance, all descend from the philosophy of one aviator who believed efficiency was not restraint, but art. He turned flight into science, then science into poetry. In the museums where the Spirit of St. Louis hangs today, visitors see a relic of courage, but engineers see something deeper: the blueprint of understanding. The line that runs from that fragile silver monoplane to the sleek jets of the 21st century is not drawn in aluminum or fuel. but in the mind of a man who asked one timeless question: how far can we go? If we go wisely, Charles Lindbergh didn't just conquer distance. He taught humanity how to respect it.